I've always noticed that real scandals announce themselves loudly. They arrive with sirens and headlines, courtroom steps and public outrage. They explode into the open, leaving no doubt that something fundamental has broken. History remembers them as moments of collapse. Baseball had one. College basketball had several. Boxing never fully recovered from its own. These scandals did not whisper. They screamed. And in that screaming, they revealed the fragile truth that sport survives only as long as it is believed. The National Football League never had that moment. That silence is not an accident. It is the starting point of this story. When people talk about corruption in sports, they usually look for evidence of chaos. Thrown games, bribes caught on tape, confessions delivered too late to matter. But the NFL offers something far more unsettling. It offers absence. No confirmed league-wide point-shaving collapse. No season erased by gambling corruption. No single scandal that forced the sport to look into the mirror and ask whether it deserved to exist at all. What remains instead is quiet. Carefully maintained quiet. The kind of quiet that suggests not innocence, but fear. I have spent years thinking about that difference, about why some sports break publicly while others never seem to fracture at all. About why football, a game built on violence, risk, and controlled chaos, somehow avoided the one threat that destroys faith completely. Not injury, not labor war, not even death. Gambling manipulation. The moment fans believe the outcome is scripted by money rather than effort, everything collapses. Attendance falls. Trust evaporates. And the sport becomes theater, not competition. The NFL understood this earlier than anyone else. This documentary is not about a scandal that happened. It is about the one that did not, and the cost of making sure it never did. In most sports, scandals arrive at the end of a process. In football, fear arrived at the beginning. The league learned from the failures of others and built its power structure around a single obsession. Protect the result. Protect belief. Protect the idea that on any given Sunday, what happens is real. That obsession shaped everything. Discipline, contracts. Silence, who was forgiven and who was erased. It created a culture where even the suggestion of gambling impropriety was treated as contamination. Careers were ended not because proof was overwhelming, but because suspicion itself was unacceptable. Football fans often talk about final seasons as physical events. The year when the body gives out. The year when the injuries no longer heal. But there is another kind of final season that almost no one recognizes in the moment. The one where a player does not lose his speed or strength, but his safety. The season where a single choice places him too close to something the league cannot tolerate. That is the final season that matters here. Not the last time a man runs onto the field, but the moment he crosses an invisible line and realizes that nothing will protect him anymore. Other sports waited for proof before acting. Football did not. It punished proximity. It punished possibility. It punished fear itself. To understand why, you have to understand what gambling corruption actually does. It does not just change a score, it destroys narrative. It turns heroism into suspicion and failure into performance. The fan stops asking whether a player tried hard enough and starts asking who was paid more. That question alone is fatal. Baseball learned this the hard way in 1919. 8 men did not just throw a World Series. They exposed the entire industry as vulnerable to money. Decades of myth collapsed in a single moment. College basketball repeated the lesson again and again. Brilliant athletes shaving points by design, not to lose, but to manipulate belief itself. The games continued, but the innocence did not. Football watched all of it, and football panicked, because the NFL knew something unique about itself. Its game was harder to fix, but easier to doubt. One blown coverage, one missed tackle, one dropped pass. All of it plausible. all of it deniable, and all of it devastating if fans stopped believing effort explained outcome. That is why the greatest threat to football was never the act of point shaving itself. It was the rumor. The league learned early that it could survive injury debates, racial tension, labor wars, even death. What it could not survive was doubt about legitimacy. Once the public began to wonder if games were shaped by money rather than competition, the entire structure would rot from the inside. So the NFL became something different, more rigid, more authoritarian, less forgiving. Fear became its organizing principle. Players were taught this lesson quietly, in locker rooms, in private meetings, in stories that traveled faster than official policy. You do not gamble, you do not associate, you do not invite suspicion. Not because you will be proven guilty, but because the league cannot afford to investigate you in public. This is where the silence begins. Unlike other scandals, the NFL's greatest gambling story lives in what was prevented rather than exposed. In decisions made before television contracts made the sport untouchable, in punishments that felt excessive by design, in a willingness to sacrifice individuals to protect the structure, and those sacrifices mattered. Because every example reinforced the message that no one was indispensable. Not stars, not champions, not legends. The shield mattered more than any name. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation. Power does not always operate through visible force. Sometimes it works through fear so internalized that resistance never forms. I often think about how fans experience this silence. They interpret it as proof of integrity, as evidence that football somehow escaped the corruption that poisoned other sports. But absence can mean many things. It can mean purity, or it can mean control. The question that drives this entire documentary is simple but uncomfortable. Did the NFL avoid point shaving because it never happened, or because the league made sure it could never surface? That distinction changes everything. It reframes discipline as deterrence rather than justice. It reframes silence as strategy rather than coincidence. And it reframes the league's spotless public record not as virtue, but as the result of relentless containment. None of this required a single catastrophic moment. No courtroom confession, no leaked audio, no televised reckoning. Just an understanding shared by those inside the system that some lines could not be crossed and some truths could not be spoken. The NFL did not wait for history to judge it. It studied history and adjusted before judgment arrived. That is why this story feels different. There is no explosion to replay, no collapse to mourn. Only the faint outline of something that might have happened and the evidence of how hard the league worked to make sure it did not. When people ask why football feels so invulnerable, they often point to money or popularity. But those are symptoms, not causes. The deeper reason is that the league identified its greatest weakness early and built a culture that treated that weakness as existential. This is the story of that culture, of what it demanded, of who it cost, and of how a sport chose survival over transparency. Because silence is not empty. Silence is filled with intention. And the NFL has been very intentional. Every sport is built on a promise. It may not be spoken out loud, but it is understood the moment a fan chooses to believe. The promise is simple. What you are watching is real. The effort is genuine. The outcome is earned. Once that promise collapses, everything collapses with it. Violence can be tolerated. Drugs can be rationalized. Labor disputes can be settled. Even tragedy can be absorbed. But when belief disappears, there is no rule change, no contract, no apology that can bring it back. That is why gambling corruption sits above every other threat in the history of sport. This documentary begins with that reality because nothing else explains the behavior of the National Football League as clearly. The NFL did not fear injury more than gambling. It did not fear lawsuits more than gambling. It did not even fear public anger as much as it feared the idea that fans might someday question whether games were decided by money rather than merit. To understand that fear, you have to understand what happened to every sport that ignored it. Baseball learned first. The 1919 World Series was not just a scandal involving 8 men. It was an existential collapse that forced the sport to confront its own fragility. Owners realized too late that underpaid players, unregulated gambling, and weak authority created the perfect conditions for manipulation. The public did not just lose trust in those players, it lost trust in the game itself. Baseball survived only because it imposed absolute authority afterward, and even then, the stain never fully faded. College basketball repeated the lesson across decades. Point shaving did not require losing games, only reshaping expectations. Players learned they could influence outcomes without appearing to cheat, and that subtlety made the betrayal worse. Fans kept watching, but with suspicion creeping into every close score. Excellence became suspect. Failure became transactional. Boxing never recovered at all. The NFL watched all of this happen while still fighting for legitimacy. In its early decades, professional football was not yet sacred. It competed with baseball for attention and survival. Its leaders understood that one significant gambling scandal would permanently relegate the sport to second-class status. That understanding shaped everything that followed. Football is structurally different from other sports, and that difference cuts both ways. On one hand, it is more difficult to fix. Outcomes depend on too many players, too many moments, too many variables. One athlete rarely controls a final score. On the other hand, football is uniquely vulnerable to doubt. Every mistake looks intentional once suspicion exists. One missed tackle can be explained as fatigue or bribery. One dropped pass can be chalked up to pressure or payment. The NFL grasped this paradox early. It realized that even unproven suspicion could be fatal. Unlike baseball, which relied on star performances and visible failures, football's chaos made it harder to prove honesty once doubt entered the room. That is why this documentary draws a clear boundary. This is not an accusation that point shaving secretly dominated the NFL. There is no evidence of that, and the league's history does not support such a claim. What this story examines instead is how deeply the fear of gambling corruption shaped behavior long before proof was necessary. The league's leadership believed that perception mattered as much as reality. In some cases, more. Early commissioners and owners spoke openly about integrity, not as a moral ideal, but as a business necessity. Football depended on faith. Lose that faith, and television contracts vanish. Stadiums empty. The product becomes indistinguishable from scripted entertainment. That belief hardened into policy. While other leagues experimented, debated, hesitated, or denied, the NFL acted with blunt certainty. Gambling and football could not coexist publicly. There would be no tolerance for nuance, no allowance for misunderstanding. The punishment for gambling-related behavior would not scale to intention. It would scale to deterrence. This approach baffled outsiders. Why punish betting as harshly as fixing? Why end careers over association rather than proof? The answer lies in the NFL's core anxiety. The league did not need to be right. It needed to be feared. Players learned quickly that protection existed only as long as they remained invisible to suspicion. The league did not market this lesson, but it did not hide it either. Every suspension became a warning broadcast far beyond the individual. Careers ended to protect credibility. Names were erased to prevent debate. This was not chaos. It was systematized control. Trust, after all, is the most valuable currency in professional sports. Fans invested emotionally, financially, and culturally. Once lost, it cannot be forced back. The NFL treated that trust as sacred, not in a sentimental way, but in a strategic one. Integrity was not just part of the brand, it was the brand. This explains why the league responded to gambling threats with a severity that often felt disproportionate. It was never about fairness to the individual. It was about certainty for the public. No ambiguity, no gray zones, no lingering questions. If baseball responded to scandal with reform, football responded with extinction-level discipline. There were structural reasons for this as well. The NFL's single-entity power structure gave it leverage other leagues lacked. Contracts were shorter. Careers were fragile. The ability to replace talent was built into the system. That reality made enforcement easier and resistance rarer. Few players were willing to risk everything for a bet when the consequences were permanent exile. Early league leadership understood that authority only works if it is exercised decisively. They learned from watching weaker commissioners lose control. They learned from scandal fatigue. They learned from public cynicism. Most importantly, they learned that stopping a scandal before it exists is far easier than restoring trust afterward. This documentary follows that philosophy forward. Not to glorify it and not to demonize it, but to examine it honestly. We will explore the moments where gambling came closest to breaching the NFL's defenses. We will examine how discipline was wielded, how fear traveled, and how silence became institutional. The story is not one of secret conspiracies, but of visible choices. Choices to sacrifice individuals rather than risk structure. Choices to punish suspicion as aggressively as proof. Choices to value belief over transparency. And we will ask the question that lingers beneath all of it. When legitimacy is preserved through fear, what does that say about the system that survives? This is the path we are about to follow. Not chasing a scandal that exploded, but tracing the shadow of one that was never allowed to breathe. The closest the National Football League ever came to collapse did not arrive with chaos or spectacle. It arrived quietly, through a conversation, through money offered rather than money proven, and through a realization that once the idea of manipulation entered the league, it might never leave. In 1946, professional football stood at a crossroads it did not yet know how to name. That year did not feel historic in the moment. It felt routine. A championship game. A postseason conclusion. But beneath that surface, something dangerous pressed close to the heart of the sport. What happened that season would not explode publicly, but it would permanently alter the way the NFL governed itself. Two players from the New York Giants were approached with an offer to fix the championship game against the Chicago Bears. Their names were Merle Hapes and Frank Filchuk. The proposal was simple and devastating. Money in exchange for influencing the outcome. Not a request to dominate the game. Not a demand to sabotage every snap. Just enough to ensure the result favored those placing bets. This was not the kind of scandal that leaves evidence behind. There was no tape, no recorded confession, no undeniable act on the field that proved manipulation beyond doubt. One player refused the offer outright. The other accepted the money, but claimed he played honestly. The Bears won the game anyway, 24-14. On the surface, nothing appeared wrong. That is what made the moment so dangerous, because the score did not matter. The damage was already done. This was the first time the NFL had to confront a terrifying truth. The threat to its legitimacy did not require failure on the field. It required possibility. The mere suggestion that a championship game could be influenced by money was enough to call the entire enterprise into question. The league reacted quickly. Too quickly, some would later argue. Both players were suspended indefinitely by Commissioner Bert Bell. There was no gradual investigation that unfolded over years. No public weighing of mitigating factors. The reaction was immediate and absolute. The message was unmistakable. Proximity to gambling itself was intolerable. That decision was not about guilt alone. 'Twas about precedent. Professional football in 1946 was still fragile. It did not yet command unquestioned loyalty from fans. Television contracts were growing, but not guaranteed. Baseball still occupied the throne of American sport. One major scandal could have erased decades of progress overnight. The league understood this instinctively. Unlike baseball, which had famously hesitated before acting decisively after its own gambling collapse, the NFL chose to overcorrect. It did not wait to see whether the public would forgive. It did not test whether explanation would soothe outrage. It acted as though forgiveness would never come. This was the moment when prevention became doctrine. The league learned that punishment did not need to feel fair to be effective. It needed to feel final. By suspending both players, regardless of the differing circumstances, the NFL signaled that nuance was a luxury it could not afford. Guilt would be debated internally. Discipline would be public and severe. That distinction defined everything that followed. It would be easy to interpret this moment as an example of moral clarity, but it was something colder than that, with strategic clarity. The league understood that the public did not care about internal complexities. Fans would remember only that gambling had touched the championship game. That memory alone was poison. So the league chose fear. For players across the league, the lesson traveled faster than any rulebook update. You could be clean, honest, and still lose everything if gambling entered your story. Protection did not come from innocence. It came from distance. This created a culture unlike any other sport, one where discipline was not calibrated to wrongdoing, but to risk. The NFL did not just punish actions, it punished scenarios. It punished the possibility of contamination. That mindset hardened quickly. League executives looked at 1946 and saw a disaster narrowly avoided. They did not celebrate survival, they studied vulnerability. They asked themselves how close they had come to losing everything and how to make sure that closeness never returned. The answer was control. From that point forward, the NFL treated gambling not as a moral failing, but as an existential enemy. It did not believe education alone would protect the game. It believed intimidation would. The indefinite suspensions of Hapes and Filchuk were eventually lifted years later, but the damage was done by then in a very different way. The message had been delivered. Careers could be erased based on association alone. The league would act first and justify later. That realization settled deeply into the fabric of professional football. Unlike other sports, where athletes sometimes felt protected by star power or union strength, NFL players understood that no such protection existed here. The league's power structure allowed it to move swiftly and decisively. Rosters were large. Careers were short. Replacement was easy. This imbalance was not incidental. It was functional. From the league's perspective, fear created stability. Fear discouraged conversation. Fear prevented experimentation. Fear ensured that even if temptation appeared, silence would follow. The 1946 incident taught the NFL that scandals do not need to succeed to destroy trust. They only need to be believable. That lesson rewired how leadership thought about integrity. It was no longer enough to punish fixing after it occurred. It had to be eradicated before it became visible. This is why the NFL's later discipline policies appear so extreme compared to other leagues. They were not reactions to repeated failure. They were the result of memory. Institutional memory rooted in a single realization. We were almost undone. And that realization never faded. As the league grew more powerful, that fear did not soften. It intensified. Bigger audiences meant bigger losses if legitimacy cracked. More money meant more incentive for manipulation. The more the NFL succeeded, the more it believed it had to protect itself from unseen threats. In that way, the 1946 championship did something no other event ever did. It taught the league that survival required authoritarian certainty. The game between the Giants and Bears did not change history on the field. It changed history behind closed doors. It created a league that would rather over-punish than apologize. One that would rather silence than explain. This was not the birth of corruption. It was the birth of paranoia. And in the NFL, paranoia became policy. When fans look back today, they often miss how narrow the escape truly was. The championship remained legitimate in the record books. The trophy was awarded. The season closed. But beneath that closure, something fundamental shifted. From that moment on, the NFL no longer believed it could recover from a gambling scandal. It believed it could only prevent one. Every decision that follows in this story flows from that belief. Fear did not announce itself loudly in the early NFL. It did not arrive with speeches or manifestos. It arrived through examples. Quiet ones at first, then unmistakable. The league learned early that rules alone do not govern behavior. Consequences do, and not fair consequences. Memorable ones? After 1946, the NFL reached a conclusion that shaped everything that followed. Justice, as most people understand it, was not enough. Justice asks whether punishment fits guilt. The NFL needed something else entirely. It needed discipline that would travel faster than explanation. It needed penalties so severe that no player would ever believe the risk was worth testing. This is where fear became policy. Early suspensions and bans in the NFL were not designed to resolve disputes. They were designed to make conversation unnecessary. The league did not want players debating legality, ethics, or personal circumstance. It wanted instinctive avoidance. An internal response so immediate that gambling-related behavior never progressed beyond temptation. Once suspicion enters their experience, the damage is immediate and lasting. Whether a player bet against his team or on it, whether he fixed a game or merely associated with gamblers. These distinctions were deliberately flattened. The message was simple. Gambling and football could not coexist. This clarity was not accidental. It was strategic. The league recognized that deterrence works best when consequences feel absolute. By making examples of players early and publicly, it conditioned behavior across the entire workforce. One career ended visibly saved countless others silently. Players talked among themselves. Stories traveled faster than official memos. Someone lost his livelihood. Someone vanished from the league. And everyone understood why. Fear does not require explanation. The shield protected the league, not the individual. that players were punished for behavior that caused no demonstrable damage on the field, that careers were sacrificed to protect appearances. The fear was not of being caught committing wrongdoing. It was of being associated with wrongdoing at all. In doing so, it denied fans something they often crave: as the league expanded, the deterrent strategy scaled with it. Bigger contracts and bigger audiences only increased the stakes. And it worked. The NFL learned that discipline does not need to be fair to be effective. It needs to be feared. That lesson echoed forward, shaping every policy, every suspension, and every whisper passed through locker rooms. Fear was not accidental, it was engineered, and it became the league's most reliable tool. And while there was no evidence that he fixed a single game, the potential for suspicion alone was enough to warrant discipline. The NFL's philosophy had crystallized decades earlier. The mere presence of gambling in a player. Life risked contaminating the sport's credibility. Intent could not mitigate risk. Reputation demanded absolutes. The announcement of Horning and Kara suspensions sent shockwaves through locker rooms across the country. Veterans who had believed in the implicit leniency of stardom suddenly understood that status offered no immunity. The league's message was unambiguous. Talent did not grant protection. Fame did not confer privilege. The shield protecting the sport's integrity stood above all, and when necessary, stars could be sacrificed to preserve it. Coaches, teammates, and younger players watched in silence. Conversations that might have explored nuances of fairness evaporated. The lesson was learned without debate. Proximity to gambling could end careers. The lesson traveled faster than any memo. Fear, cultivated deliberately, became internalized. This rigid approach reshaped behavior across the league. Players began policing themselves. Conversations about gambling and association became taboo. Even casual mentions of betting were sufficient to unsettle teammates. The impact extended far beyond the individual cases, altering attitudes, practices, and decisions for the entire player community. Veterans repeated the lessons through anecdotes. The stories were devoid of embellishment. They needed no dramatization. Horning's absence from games was its own narrative. The league's authority was no longer solely administrative. It had become psychological, cultural, and deeply personal. It had tolerated ambiguity, allowed debate, and delayed decisive action. Even the appearance of impropriety carried risk. Careers were measured not only by performance on the field, but by alignment with the League's interpretation of propriety off it. The shield of football's integrity now extended beyond rules and into every personal choice. Horning and Karras, in their absence from play, communicated a broader moral geography to every individual in the league. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate contemporaries. Future generations entering the NFL inherited an environment in which fear of association outweighed fear of competition. The game demanded physical excellence, strategic intellect, and emotional resilience. But it also demanded absolute adherence to an unwritten covenant. Do not compromise the game's integrity, intentionally or inadvertently. Horning and Karras became reference points for this covenant. Their stories were told and retold. Young players memorized the consequences and calibrated their behavior accordingly. It was a silent pedagogy, transmitted through absence and reputation, as effective as any formal instruction. In evaluating the league's decisions, it is important to note the complexity of moral and institutional calculus. On one hand, the suspensions may appear disproportionate when measured against individual conduct. On the other hand, the NFL was not adjudicating individual morality. It was managing systemic risk. Protecting the shield required acts that, viewed in isolation, could seem extreme. Viewed in context, they were methodical, deliberate, and aligned with an overarching philosophy of preemptive preservation. Horning and Karras were neither villains nor heroes in the traditional sense. They were instruments in a calculated strategy to maintain the league's survival. The long-term effect of these policies reshaped the cultural fabric of the NFL. Players entered the league knowing that the consequences of perceived impropriety could outweigh the rewards of talent, fame, or even competitive success. The system encouraged compliance through fear rather than persuasion. Authority became internalized. Behavioral norms were established through example rather than codified rule. Horning and Karras cases remained touchstones for decades, reinforcing a continuity of institutional values that emphasized survival over leniency, deterrence over justice, and the collective good over individual circumstance. This philosophy continues to echo through modern football, even as the league evolves and betting becomes legal and regulated in various contexts. The precedent set by sacrificing stars to protect the shield established an enduring principle. Perception and trust matter more than intent and nuance. NFL history demonstrates repeatedly that when individual actions threaten the integrity of the collective enterprise, the collective enterprise takes precedence. Horning and Karras, long retired and immortalized in record books, are remembered not solely for their athletic achievements, but for their symbolic role in reinforcing the league's foundational lesson. Their absence resonates as an enduring reminder that in professional football, no individual is bigger than the system. Football is, at its core, a sport of controlled chaos. Unlike baseball or basketball, where a single player can dramatically influence the outcome, football distributes agency across dozens of individuals, each responsible for precise execution within a broader system. Coaches call plays with the hope of exploiting mismatches, yet each decision interacts with hundreds of variables. One missed tackle might cost a yard. One dropped pass might allow a drive to continue. The NFL understood that even when manipulation was mathematically implausible, the appearance of it could erode trust completely. One improbable error, one blown coverage in a critical moment, could ignite suspicion. This is the paradox the league confronted. A game so resistant to manipulation was also highly vulnerable to doubt. Integrity was therefore less about actual control of outcomes and more about preventing the perception that outcomes were controlled. This is why league leadership maintained what outsiders often called paranoia. The league's internal culture treated any proximity to gambling or undue influence as an existential threat. Rules were enforced not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to prevent rumor, to extinguish the possibility of doubt before it reached public awareness. The effectiveness of this system depended on anticipatory action rather than reactive investigation. In the minds of NFL leadership, a scandal in perception alone could threaten the viability of the sport more than isolated acts of corruption. Structural resistance and perception paranoia intersected to produce a unique organizational philosophy. While other leagues focused on catching cheaters after the fact, the NFL emphasized prevention through fear. Players internalize the rules, not through formal instruction alone, but through example, precedent, and constant messaging. Rules surrounding gambling, association with bettors, and disclosure were codified with rigid clarity. Every case communicated to current and future players that the league's commitment to integrity transcended individual talent or circumstance. No player was exempt. No consideration of intent could mitigate the visible consequence. This culture of enforced perception management extended from Hall of Famers to rookies, embedding a uniform understanding that integrity is as much about appearance as reality. Paranoia extended into procedural practices as well. The NFL's centralized oversight of officiating, game reporting, travel, scheduling, and administrative monitoring were designed not only for efficiency, but to create transparency, predictability, and resilience. Observers outside the system saw standardization. Inside the league, standardization was a mechanism of risk mitigation. The strategy reinforced structural integrity and cultivated a culture in which even minor deviations were noticed and addressed promptly. Players and coaches understood that deviation, even for personal gain, carried systemic consequences. The complexity of football, combined with the league's vigilance and cultural reinforcement of fear, created a resilient ecosystem. The result is the absence of a major point-shaving scandal in professional football. Not because the opportunity was impossible, but because the perception of risk outweighed the temptation. The league designed its culture to internalize vigilance, thereby multiplying the effectiveness of formal enforcement structures. The long-term implication is clear. The NFL's structural resistance is as much psychological as it is operational. Its culture does not rely solely on rules, supervision, or analytics. It relies on the internalization of expectation, the anticipation of scrutiny, and the understanding that perception governs legitimacy. The sport's complexity protects against direct manipulation. The league's paranoia protects against indirect collapse through doubt. Together, these elements form a comprehensive defense that extends beyond measurable probability into the realm of belief and trust. In football, survival is contingent not only on the integrity of play, but on the collective confidence in that integrity. Every major disciplinary action, every high-profile suspension, and every preventative policy can be understood through this lens. Players respond with internalized compliance, fans retain confidence, and the sport continues unbroken. It is the product of deliberate structural design, psychological conditioning, and an enduring commitment to safeguarding perception. Complexity provides the means. Paranoia ensures the message is understood. In the National Football League, not all battles are fought in the open. Some of the most consequential moments occur quietly beneath the surface, unseen by fans, unreported by media, and often unknown to the broader football community. These moments define the league's culture of enforcement, a culture that prizes containment over exposure. Where other sports rely on public trials, investigations, and headlines to deter misconduct, football has perfected the art of quiet enforcement. It is a system designed to manage risk without attracting attention, to resolve threats before they become crises, and to communicate consequences without drawing scrutiny. In this environment, silence becomes a policy tool, and control often outweighs transparency. From the earliest days, league leadership understood that exposure could be fatal. A scandal that leaks into the public sphere is difficult to contain. Even a minor association with gambling or other forms of manipulation can be amplified by press coverage, fan speculation, and social discourse. The NFL recognized that the optics of wrongdoing can be as destructive as wrongdoing itself. In response, the league adopted a philosophy in which internal investigations were conducted methodically, discreetly, and without record beyond what was necessary. Evidence was gathered, questions were asked, and warnings were issued, but rarely were these actions documented publicly. The goal was containment. The message was clear to anyone involved: resolve the threat internally, maintain credibility externally. Warnings were an essential component of this system. Players, coaches, and staff could receive guidance or admonishment without the need for formal charges. These interactions were often verbal, informal, and carefully calibrated to protect both the individual and the league. They created an invisible network of accountability. Those who were warned knew they were being observed, understood the potential consequences, and adjusted behavior accordingly. Yet the wider public remained unaware. Silence in these cases was not neglect. It was strategy. It allowed the league to enforce standards while maintaining the appearance of order and continuity. Transparency, in this context, was treated as a vulnerability. The distinction between legality and survival is central to understanding quiet enforcement. Legal transgressions are addressed within formal judicial frameworks. Survival in the NFL requires compliance with expectations that often extend beyond the law. Betting association with gamblers, or behavior that risks public perception, may not be illegal in a technical sense, but the league treats such conduct as existentially threatening. By addressing infractions quietly, the NFL enforces a set of rules designed to protect the system rather than punish individuals for breaking civil statutes. In this environment, career preservation, team cohesion, and institutional credibility are paramount. Legal frameworks matter, but they are secondary to the survival of the league's reputation. Control replaces transparency in every aspect of quiet enforcement. The league does not publicize investigations or outcomes unless absolutely necessary. Discipline is applied selectively, with attention to context, visibility, and impact. Players internalize the rules because they recognize that scrutiny exists everywhere, even when it is not visible. The system operates through a combination of precedent, communication, and psychological conditioning. Those who understand it comply proactively. Those who challenge it risk isolation, reduced playing time, or in extreme cases, suspension. Yet the outside world may never know the circumstances. Football's power is therefore both administrative and cultural, embedded in expectations rather than headlines. This system has evolved to address multiple layers of potential threats. Internal monitoring identifies patterns of behavior that could create suspicion. Player associations, personal conduct, and even casual remarks are noted and managed discreetly. Warnings are tailored to individual circumstances. Repeat offenders may face formal sanctions, but even then, the league often seeks to manage exposure. By resolving issues quietly, the NFL minimizes the potential for public interpretation that could undermine trust. Silence becomes a shield, protecting the game from perception-based crises as effectively as it protects from actual misconduct. The difference between legality and survival also affects how investigations are conducted. Legal investigations require evidence, documentation, and procedural fairness. Survival-oriented enforcement prioritizes risk assessment, psychological impact, and containment. Evidence may be sufficient to issue a warning, but not for prosecution. Documentation may exist in limited internal records, but is withheld from public view. The league is less concerned with proving guilt than it is with preventing the appearance of corruption. This approach ensures that even potential threats are neutralized before they can escalate, reinforcing both operational stability and public confidence. The strategic use of quiet enforcement also shapes organizational culture. Players and staff understand that behavior is monitored continuously. The possibility of a warning, an internal review, or an informal conversation exerts influence comparable to formal discipline. This creates a self-regulating environment in which compliance is habitual rather than coerced. The system operates as a psychological deterrent, reinforcing the values of integrity and vigilance. Individuals who internalize the expectations become custodians of the culture themselves, observing and correcting peers before issues reach leadership. Quiet enforcement, in this sense, multiplies the league's capacity to maintain control without external interference. The impact on long-term league stability cannot be overstated. By addressing potential issues privately, the NFL reduces the likelihood of public scandal and maintains consistent fan confidence. It preserves the credibility of championships, the legitimacy of records, and the authenticity of competition. In a league where perception is as critical as performance, quiet enforcement functions as an invisible yet powerful mechanism for sustaining the system. Fans rarely recognize its influence, but its absence would be immediately apparent through disruption, controversy, and erosion of trust. It is both preventative and protective, designed to maintain equilibrium in a high-stakes environment. This philosophy also informs the league's response to emerging threats. As gambling regulations evolve, as new media platforms provide increased visibility, and as the business of football expands, quiet enforcement remains a core strategy. Investigations continue internally, warnings are delivered discreetly, and disciplinary measures are calibrated to impact culture rather than generate headlines. The balance between containment and exposure is continually assessed. The principle remains consistent. Prioritize the survival of the institution above all else. Transparency may be desirable in theory, but it is subordinated to the operational reality that a single perceived violation can damage the entire ecosystem. The NFL's approach contrasts sharply with other professional sports leagues. Baseball, basketball, and hockey have historically relied on publicized investigations, trials, and sanctions to maintain credibility. While these methods achieve accountability, they also expose institutions to media scrutiny and fan speculation. Football's quiet enforcement strategy reduces exposure and preserves discretion. By managing threats internally, the league exerts control over both the reality and perception of integrity. The system ensures that the game continues uninterrupted, and that confidence in its legitimacy remains high. In football, stability is achieved not through publicity, but through containment. The effectiveness of quiet enforcement also depends on consistent application. Leadership must exercise judgment, discretion, and timing to ensure that interventions do not appear arbitrary or unfair. Players must perceive that rules are enforced reliably, even if outcomes are invisible to the public. This balance between authority and discretion reinforces internal compliance. Fear, precedent, and culture converge to create a regulatory ecosystem in which misconduct is discouraged and the integrity of the game is preserved. Quiet enforcement, therefore, functions as both a deterrent and a reinforcement of institutional norms, shaping behavior in ways that extend far beyond formal policies or documented sanctions. In many respects, the power of quiet enforcement is psychological. Players internalize the league's expectations and adjust behavior preemptively. The system operates through anticipation, reputation management, and cultural reinforcement. Missteps are corrected before they escalate. The absence of public exposure does not diminish accountability. On the contrary, it amplifies it, because players recognize that consequences are inevitable, even when invisible. This invisible hand of enforcement shapes not only individual behavior, but organizational culture, ensuring that integrity remains embedded in every aspect of professional football. Control replaces transparency. Silence becomes policy. Survival becomes paramount. The NFL's quiet enforcement strategy has endured because it aligns with the league's broader philosophy of preemptive protection. By addressing threats internally and discreetly, the league preserves its credibility, maintains fan trust, and minimizes vulnerability to scandal. Warnings issued without records, investigations conducted out of public view, and sanctions applied strategically create a controlled environment in which perception and reality are consistently aligned. The system prioritizes survival over exposition, message over nuance, and culture over transparency. Quiet enforcement is the silent engine that ensures the game remains intact, credible, and respected decades after the first crisis threatened to disrupt its trajectory. Professional football has always existed in a peculiar relationship with gambling. Publicly, the league condemned it. Betting was a vice, a threat, a corrupting influence that could destroy the purity of the game. Headlines of the mid-20th century castigated players who even dabbled. Commissioners spoke in moral absolutes. The narrative was straightforward. Gambling was an enemy to be resisted, excluded, and punished. While denouncing it in public, football monitored it obsessively behind closed doors. Every line, every odd, every rumor that hinted at irregularity was noted, analyzed, and acted upon. The contradiction of gambling oversight became a defining characteristic of the NFL's strategy for preserving integrity. Public hostility toward gambling served a clear purpose. It set the tone for expectations. Fans internalized the idea that football was sacrosanct, untouched by the financial machinations that could taint other sports. Baseball had suffered from scandal after scandal, each incident eroding confidence. Football could not afford the same erosion. Public condemnation created a shield of social norms. Players were aware of it because their reputations, their careers, and their livelihoods depended on maintaining a public persona aligned with these norms. The threat of ostracization, criticism, and moral judgment became another lever of compliance. It was a psychological strategy that worked alongside formal discipline, ensuring that players understood the stakes without requiring explicit surveillance to be fully effective. Yet the league's private engagement with gambling was meticulous. Unlike in public statements where the league denied the legitimacy of gambling, behind the scenes, it understood the importance of vigilance. Odd patterns could signal potential corruption, shifts in player behavior, or the emergence of illicit networks. Monitoring was both preventive and diagnostic. It allowed league officials to detect potential threats before they escalated into public crises. This duality, outright condemnation in public paired with private scrutiny, was not hypocritical. It was strategic. The NFL understood that perception governed credibility. Open acknowledgement of monitoring could invite scrutiny, debate, and speculation. Silence and invisibility made the oversight far more effective. Even casual interactions with individuals known to gamble could trigger warnings or internal review. By eliminating ambiguity about association, the NFL strengthened its deterrent effect. The culture of fear was reinforced not merely by punishments, but by a pervasive awareness that reputations were constantly observed. Players learned to avoid temptation entirely, often long before any opportunity arose, because the threat of implicit consequence loomed large. Integrity was maintained less by monitoring individual behavior than by shaping the environment in which behavior could occur. The contradiction of public hostility and private vigilance had broader implications. It established a framework in which the league could maintain credibility while exercising control. Fans perceived a strict moral stance. Players internalized a culture of compliance. Commissioners could intervene strategically without exposing operational vulnerabilities. It was a sophisticated balancing act, a form of governance that recognized the limits of transparency in a complex social system. Awareness of oversight produced behavioral adjustments. Players conducted themselves as if they were always observed, and in doing so, they often complied without direct intervention. The contradiction also reinforced the symbolic nature of enforcement. Punishments, warnings, and public statements served as signals. Private monitoring ensured that these symbols were not empty. They were supported by substantive investigation, careful intelligence, and strategic anticipation of risk. The league maintained credibility on multiple levels simultaneously. The public believed in the absence of scandal. Internally, participants understood that threat, surveillance, and discipline were constant. Both perception and reality were carefully managed. Players learned to compartmentalize, avoiding contexts in which reputational or institutional risk could arise. Social behavior became a critical dimension of professional responsibility. The league's vigilance extended beyond performance on the field to encompass personal networks, public statements, and even lifestyle choices. Maintaining credibility required constant attention, discipline, and foresight. The paradox of gambling oversight created a culture in which risk was internalized and self-regulated. Belief in fairness must be unwavering. Public condemnation, private monitoring, and fear of association combined to create an ecosystem in which manipulation was improbable and suspicion was minimized. The contradiction, outright hostility, paired with meticulous internal oversight, was a deliberate strategy to align behavior, perception, and reality. High-profile suspensions, publicized warnings, or rumors of association with gambling could render a player unemployable, regardless of prior performance or talent. In such a precarious environment, defending a teammate accused of gambling risks eroding one's own position. The combination of personal risk, collective vulnerability, and historical precedent created a psychological ecosystem in which the league's expectations were absorbed without direct intervention. Stories of high-profile suspensions, quiet investigations, and preventative warnings circulated within locker rooms as lessons in survival. Players learned to self-monitor, to police behavior, and to correct colleagues discreetly. The effect was cumulative. Each generation of players inherited the knowledge that compliance, not resistance, was the path to career preservation. By the time they reached the professional level, many athletes had internalized the mechanisms of discipline so thoroughly that explicit enforcement was often unnecessary. Silence became both self-imposed and institutionally reinforced. The choice to remain silent was not merely strategic. It was a reflection of a stark power imbalance within the league. Commissioners, team owners, and executives controlled employment, salaries, and disciplinary outcomes. Players, even when organized through unions, had limited leverage to contest allegations or defend colleagues effectively. The union itself often deferred to league authority in matters concerning gambling, point shaving, or integrity-related issues. This imbalance ensured that challenging league narratives carried significant personal risk and offered little institutional protection. It represented an acknowledgement of the structural realities of power within professional football and a rational approach to navigating them. Defending a peer in such circumstances risked not only the defender's career, but the credibility of the union itself. It allowed the NFL to manage potential threats with minimal disruption while simultaneously reinforcing behavioral norms across the player population. It demonstrates how careers, reputations, and personal trajectories are governed not only by performance on the field, but by alignment with league expectations off it. Internalized discipline and fear of association created a social equilibrium in which compliance was incentivized, deviation discouraged, and integrity maintained. Unions, historical precedent, and professional norms combined to shape behavior without necessitating direct enforcement. Players learned that silence was safer than resistance, that observation and conformity were essential to survival, and that the power imbalance within the league was an unassailable reality. In this context, silence was not passivity, but strategic adaptation, a necessary response to the demands of professional football's most unforgiving regulatory environment. This is not to suggest that the league's games were tainted or outcomes manipulated, but rather that the perception of purity became an instrument of protection. Coaches and management reinforce this caution through subtle messaging, internal discipline, and example. Commissioners, executives, and team owners understood the power of this perception. Maintaining a clean record was both symbolic and practical. It reinforced compliance among players and staff and ensured that public confidence remained unwavering. Belief itself reinforced protection. Fans who trusted the league's integrity were less likely to scrutinize anomalies or question unusual performances. In this context, myth-making became operationally advantageous. The story of the NFL as untainted was not accidental. It was an outcome of deliberate, cultural, administrative, and psychological strategies designed to prevent scandal before it could manifest publicly. Historical examples illustrate the power of this dynamic. Consider the early decades of the NFL, when the threat of gambling was pronounced. Coaches and players acted conservatively, understanding that behavior could be observed and interpreted internally. Officials responded discreetly to anomalies in performance or association. The result was that potential stories never crystallized. The psychological impact on players and management was significant. Belief in the system created self-reinforcing compliance. Management operated with confidence that oversight mechanisms were effective, even if invisible. The illusion of integrity was maintained through consistent reinforcement. Every investigation, warning, or disciplinary measure was designed to be effective without attracting public attention. Fans were presented with results, statistics, and narratives that emphasized merit, competition, and fairness. Media coverage focused on performance and human interest rather than speculation about corruption. Players internalized expectations through mentorship, precedent, and subtle cues from leadership. The absence of publicized scandals reinforced the perception that football was uniquely resistant to manipulation. Over time, this perception became self-evident. Belief in purity became operationally indispensable. It protected the league even as underlying oversight mechanisms functioned quietly, effectively, and continuously. The absence of scandal is not mere luck. It is the product of deliberate cultural management, disciplined enforcement, and narrative control. Players, journalists, and fans all participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in maintaining a perception that served the league's survival. The result is a sport in which the myth of purity protects reality, and the reality of oversight is inseparable from the belief in ethical competition. Media reluctance, rumor containment, and proactive communication established a framework in which belief reinforced compliance. The league's reputation functioned as a living safeguard. The absence of scandal became a strategic asset, preserving credibility, ensuring fan trust, and shaping behavior. Integrity in football was as much about what was unseen as what was visible. The illusion itself operated as a form of protection, continuously sustaining the system and mitigating risk. In professional football, the story of purity is inseparable from the mechanisms that maintain it. And belief, both public and internal, becomes a force that preserves the game from collapse. For decades, betting was a specter, an existential danger that could destroy careers and tarnish championships. The systems of quiet oversight, warnings, and self-regulation that once existed inform modern practices, ensuring that even in a landscape saturated with wagering, control is maintained. The legacy of fear persists as both deterrent and framework. It ensures that professional football remains disciplined, even as the contours of risk have evolved. The discipline that once relied on fear, silence, and perception now operates in tandem with formalized systems, creating a dual layer of protection. The evolution from absolute prohibition to conditional acceptance demonstrates both continuity and change. Players are aware, always, that behavior is observed. The league's reputation, carefully curated over decades, relies on belief, discipline, and strategic visibility. Legalized betting does not erase these foundations. It leverages them, operationalizing fear as a component of strategy rather than merely as a defensive posture. The narrative of the NFL's relationship with gambling over time underscores a central paradox. Freedom and constraint coexist. Players operate in an environment of legalized betting, yet they remain constrained by rules, monitoring, and historical expectation. The league profits from engagement while safeguarding the integrity that once justified fear. Fans enjoy transparency, odds, and data, while internal enforcement ensures fairness and trust. The past terror of scandal has been transformed into contemporary infrastructure. Fear, once reactive and moralistic, is now systematic, codified, and preventative. It persists as a latent force, shaping behavior, reinforcing compliance, and protecting the credibility of the game, even as the landscape has shifted dramatically. Ultimately, the legal betting era demonstrates that the NFL's approach to integrity is adaptive rather than static. The principles of oversight, containment, and internal discipline that governed the league for decades have been preserved, repurposed for modern circumstances. The league's culture ensures that even as profit motives align with public access to gambling, the core imperative of preserving credibility remains paramount. Fear is no longer the moralized terror of a previous era. It is an operational asset, ensuring that history's lessons are not forgotten even as the game evolves. The NFL continues to navigate the delicate balance between commercial opportunity and institutional preservation, demonstrating the resilience, foresight, and strategic sophistication that have defined its governance across generations. Professional football is a league defined as much by what it has prevented as by what it has achieved on the field. The NFL's greatest scandal is the one that never happened. This is not hyperbole or an exercise in counterfactual history. It is a recognition that the league's meticulous strategies, discipline, and culture of fear prevented manipulation before it could materialize into public catastrophe. The story of what was sacrificed in the name of prevention is one that has rarely been told in full, obscured behind quiet investigations, private warnings, and the silent departures of players who might have otherwise faced public scrutiny. These decisions, taken in the shadows, reveal a league whose governance relied not on spectacle but on quiet, absolute control. In the NFL, the absence of scandal is not luck. 'Tis the legacy of vigilance. The NFL sacrificed stars to protect the shield. Players whose careers were cut short, whose reputations were shadowed, and whose potential never fully materialized, were often lost, not for public infractions, but for the sake of preserving perception. Suspensions, fines, and exclusions were applied with precision, and often with minimal explanation outside the league office. Careers ended without public justification, leaving fans, journalists, and even teammates unaware of the precise reasoning behind these decisions. The players themselves understood the stakes. They internalized lessons from predecessors whose mistakes or suspected mistakes had shaped the culture. Survival required not merely skill on the field, but alignment with the invisible rules that governed morality, perception, and behavior off it. The league's priorities were clear. Individual aspirations could be subordinated to institutional preservation. Fear became a central instrument of governance. The league recognized early that public condemnation alone was insufficient to ensure compliance. Players had to feel, internalize, and anticipate the consequences of any potential infraction. This required a system in which observation, discipline, and education worked together, creating a psychological framework that governed conduct without constant intervention. The threat of suspicion, of silent scrutiny, of career jeopardy was more powerful than any overt punishment. Players self-regulated, ensuring that even in the absence of formal enforcement, behaviors aligned with league expectations. The effectiveness of fear as a governance tool relied on its consistency and predictability, but also on its invisibility. Athletes understood that compliance was as much about perception as it was about morality. The league understood that a single publicized scandal could compromise decades of credibility, fan trust, and commercial growth. Prevention, therefore, was the ultimate imperative, and the costs were borne quietly, often by the individuals most exposed to risk. One of the most profound lessons of this era is that prevention required sacrifice at multiple levels. Players, coaches, and even staff were compelled to adjust behavior, internalize expectations, and accept the consequences of invisible oversight. Careers were shortened, opportunities were curtailed, and reputations were managed silently to avoid potential crises. Yet this same system preserved the league's broader legitimacy. Fans rarely witnessed the consequences because the processes were concealed. The result was a continuity of perception that reinforced trust in the game's integrity. The tension between individual cost and institutional benefit defines the NFL's approach to governance, and it is a tension that continues to shape professional football to this day. The permanence of fear underpins this system. Even as the league evolved, embracing legalized betting, commercial expansion, and global recognition, the foundational principle remained the same. Integrity cannot be assumed. It must be actively preserved. The lessons of history suspensions, quiet investigations, warnings, and the management of perception have informed contemporary practices. Modern integrity units, monitoring systems, and educational programs all trace their lineage to decades in which fear, discretion, and institutional oversight created an environment in which scandal was improbable. Perception, carefully managed, became a protective mechanism, ensuring that games could be played without interference, suspicion, or manipulation. In this sense, the NFL's legacy is defined not only by victories on the field, but by the discipline, vigilance, and foresight exercised off it. The permanence of this approach highlights a profound truth about professional football. The prevention of scandal requires continuous investment, vigilance, and strategic foresight. The mechanisms developed over decades, from quiet warnings to internal investigations to the cultivation of a culture of fear, have been adapted to modern contexts, including legalized betting, commercial growth, and global expansion. Yet the underlying principle remains unchanged. The league's survival depends on the perception and reality of integrity. Players, staff, and fans alike participate in maintaining this ecosystem, consciously or unconsciously, through compliance, observation, and belief. Ultimately, the scandal that never happened is the NFL's most enduring achievement. It is a story not of exposure but of prevention, not of chaos but of careful, calculated management. Careers were curtailed, opportunities were lost, and fear was institutionalized. Yet the result was a league whose integrity became its defining feature. This legacy of prevention underscores the league's capacity to govern effectively, to protect its reputation, and to shape the behavior of participants without the necessity of public spectacle. In the NFL, survival, perception, and discipline are intertwined, and the absence of scandal is the clearest evidence of their enduring success. This duality, the coexistence of profit and protection, underscores the sophistication of the NFL's governance. The league has adapted to a new landscape while preserving the essential principle that trust is the most valuable currency in professional sports. Players, staff, and management operate within an environment where behavior is observed, evaluated, and corrected in real time. Perception, belief, and discipline continue to interact as they always have, ensuring that the public's faith in the game is justified, even if the mechanisms of preservation remain invisible. Survival, in this sense, is inseparable from power, control, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. Reframing success as containment rather than innocence allows for a deeper understanding of the league's resilience. While fans often measure success in championships, statistics, or individual brilliance, the NFL's longevity and cultural dominance are also the product of its ability to prevent corruption before it reaches the public stage. The league's governance strategies, from quiet investigations to inherited cultural norms, from internalized discipline to media management, form a lattice of control that protects outcomes, maintains credibility, and sustains fan trust. This containment strategy, while largely unseen, has shaped the behavior of countless participants, demonstrating that influence, perception, and subtle enforcement can be as effective as overt regulation. The documentary S-Journey has highlighted the paradox at the heart of professional football. The game's integrity has been preserved not through innocence, transparency, or moral purity, but through calculated, deliberate, and sometimes harsh enforcement. Careers were curtailed, personal ambitions were sacrificed, and silence was institutionalized. Yet these measures ensured the survival of the sport itself. The story of what was prevented, the scandal that never happened, is as critical as the story of what was achieved on the field. The NFL's power resides not only in its economic or cultural influence, but in its capacity to manage risk, shape behavior, and maintain belief across decades. This understanding reframes how we perceive the league's history and legacy. Modern betting introduces additional complexity, but the core tension remains unchanged. Profit and vigilance coexist, yet the underlying fear, discipline, and authority that have defined the NFL's operations continue to shape conduct. Players understand that even in a permissive environment, boundaries exist, and the consequences of violation, public or private, are serious. Integrity units, monitoring systems, and educational programs function as the evolved descendants of historical strategies. They codify, formalize, and modernize the principles that once operated informally. Yet the psychological weight of consequence continues to govern behavior. Fear, belief, and compliance remain central to the league's endurance. Finally, the unresolved tension that permeates this narrative is intentional. Professional football operates in a perpetual state of balancing risk and opportunity, perception and reality, profit and preservation. The league has mastered containment, yet the fundamental challenges, human ambition, public scrutiny, and the potential for misconduct persist. The story of the NFL demonstrates the remarkable effectiveness of structural discipline, cultural enforcement, and strategic perception management, yet it also acknowledges that the game's survival is never guaranteed. The specter of scandal, though suppressed, exists as a constant reminder of vulnerability, ensuring that vigilance, discipline, and authority remain central to governance. As we reflect on the entire journey, the lesson is clear. The NFL's legitimacy has been preserved through power, control, and the orchestration of fear as much as through any intrinsic virtue. Silence, internalized discipline, and careful management of perception have been more effective than public regulation or moral exhortation. Careers were sacrificed to protect the institution. Historical precedent informed contemporary practice, and belief in integrity became both protective and performative. The league's survival is not the product of innocence, but of foresight, strategic governance, and a continuous commitment to containment. The story of professional football is, in many ways, the story of control itself. And the lesson for future generations is both sobering and instructive.